work. So allow me to welcome him, former council member LSK, David Njoroge. Thank you very much. So without taking too much of your time, allow me to cede the floor to Professor Mbote to come and set the stage for us. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Allow me to say that I am home. Strathmore is all me. And when I was asked to make a presentation on using mediation in the quest for women's land rights, I thought that it is good, first of all, to look at what is land and what does land represent in the spaces that we are in. And then, what is gender? And looking at land and gender will automatically begin to show you why women's access or quest for access to justice in land is problematic. So we then look at justice and also look at women in the justice system. And you can't look at mediation as a standalone, because mediation is one way of resolving disputes. And I'll give you a background on why I became interested in women's rights and land. Back in 1994, I was a young lecturer. And we were then working on women and law in East Africa. And so we wanted to see what are the issues that arise when widows seek rights to land and to property. And what we discovered was that going through the court system, looking at the judgments, there weren't many cases by women. And so we asked ourselves, is it because women have no issues dealing with land or dealing with, that they have no contests at all? And I thank the people that introduced me to social legal law, because we then went out to look for widows and widowers and to ask what happened when your wife died, what happened when your husband died. And in that question came out huge disparities in the experiences of men and women when they had experienced death and were seeking to access property. And one of the things that stood for me was asking women in certain parts of Kenya and Uganda, what worries you most about death? And some of them said, death doesn't worry me because land will come to me. What worries me is accessing the land when my husband is alive. And in essence then, that is the context within which one has to look at what does land represent, what is gender, and then how does justice play out. We must begin, of course, by noting the imbalance between men and women in ownership of land. When I was an astute researcher and had fingers at my fingertips, they used to say only 5% women own land. I don't know whether that has gone up or whether we are still talking about 5%. But I'd like us to problematize this whole notion of ownership, control, and access, because it is at the heart of the disputes that arise. Many of us in Africa deal with land laws that have been introduced, which introduced exclusive ownership of land. In many of our communities, there was inclusive ownership. In fact, many communities frowned upon having people who had no land and would have ways of making them access land. When we introduced titling of land, many people fell through the cracks. And for those of you who studied land law in the 70s and 80s, There were cases, for instance, in Kenya, where when people were asked who should be registered as the owner of the land, they identified the leader of the family. Leader of family is hardly ever a woman. It is usually men. And then, once it was titled, if you remember, the CAP 300, the act that dealt with registration of land, the rights that were given at that point could not be challenged at all. So what happened was a change in the way land was being held to a space where people were now being put out as exclusive holders of land that previously had been allowed others to access. So we now have the issue of women and land rights. If we had lived with the trusteeship of a land, which should have been what was given, not absolute rights to land, then I would like to surmise that we would have had less quarrels over land, because women's work on land, and I want to say that women in Africa work the land a lot. They have access to land to work on. But when it comes to owning, they access land through fiduciary relationships. And those fiduciary relationships are fathers, husbands, even sons. And I'm sure you've seen cases where sons contest the rights of their mothers to have rights to land when their fathers have died. And that then tells us that we need to begin to think about how we deal with land in our justice system. There are two goals in the Sustainable Development Goals that deal, one with gender, that is goal number 5, and the other one with access to justice. And the access to justice talks about not just the rules, but also the institutions. When there are land claims, in fact, at earlier times, for those of you who remember, magistrates' courts actually worked very closely with elders in determining land claims. And it is in that space of elders where you would then know who had access. I talked about ownership. Ownership is the highest form, and that is the title. Access, for many women, as long as they are in functional relationships, there is never an issue of access, because they will be able to farm the land. Again, carrying out research in this country, women had access to even big farm animals because they were taking care of them. But ownership is usually in who is recognized as the head, and it is usually the males. And so when you have disputes on land, many of them they could relate to when a marriage breaks down, matrimonial property. And so you now have this whole question of who owns. And in the discussions of contribution, if you look at the Matrimonial Property Act 2013, my own quarrel with that act is first that it didn't look at how that whole question of access. Because you see, when you're in a functional relationship of marriage, you don't live with receipts waiting to prove this was my contribution. And for those of you who've been in matrimonial disputes, you have seen women being thrown out, being asked, can you take away the roof if that is what you bought with your cooperative loan? And I remember this Chief Justice, when she was a lawyer, saying how a woman was being told, you built this house on your in-laws' land, please take it away. Of course, you know, land the concept of ownership of land includes everything in the land. So even the labor that women expend on land makes the land more profitable and more valuable. And in a place like Kenya, where land may be in the great-grandfather's name, and you're living on it thinking that you own, but you have access, that access can actually be cut even before you know how to say anything. There is also the question of death that I had talked about. So when women go to court, how do they fare? I think many times, and I thank people who introduced me to social legal research, to consider what are the odds that women surmount in going to court. We talk about access to justice. Can they afford? Is it close to them? But there are other issues. If a woman has a baby, can you imagine a baby in court? Isn't that already destabilizing? So as women seek, a woman's quest for access to justice may be even problematized just because of the fact that they have a child to look after. That is where mediation comes in. I think mediation allows women to ventilate issues and to be at fora where they can discuss more freely. Again, looking at a case in Zimbabwe, a woman's husband had died, and she was told, you are entitled to all the property. But the woman said to the judge, wait, no, I can't take all of it. What about my mother-in-law and my brothers-in-law? And the reason she was saying that was because she knew she could take all the property, but her children would not have identity as members of the family. So the give and take that mediation allows is a lot more amenable to resolving women's disputes, especially with regard to land, because of what land is and because of how women are held. The gender division of labor, I need not belabor that women will be working the land. But when it comes to who owns, and you see, there is ownership, yes, then access, but there is also control. Women are allowed to control, like where do you plant beans? What do you do with the land? But you see, at the end of the day, the problem is going to be who owns. I'll end by giving an example from Kenya, where, in communities where there is wife inheritance. Where there is wife inheritance, many women sometimes would not have people to inherit them. Because, when you inherit the woman, then you take responsibility over them. And with the advent of HIV and AIDS, there was a very big problem with women becoming destitute because they were not being taken into the community. And Kelin, an organization in Kenya, began to engage traditional elders to get the women to stay on the land without having to be sent away because nobody inherited them. And again, doing research on that whole concept of inheritance. Inheritance worked in many communities in Kenya. It was not about a lot about the sexual relationships between the parties. It was more taking them in and taking them under your cover. So mediation allows you to bring all these things. And maybe as lawyers, many times we need to question ourselves, how do we get in the way of access to justice? And how can we let people ventilate? This is why it's good that now there's court annexed mediation, because people can go and talk about the issues that affect them. But I think we should make certain things to be more binding within the mediation space. 10 minutes is not a long time, and giving a professor 10 minutes is So I've tried my best.
We appreciate you, Professor. We are going to spare some 10 minutes for question and answer. So I believe it's not yet over, and then also there'll be after break. So I want to thank the professor for setting the pace. Lawyers, you've been challenged. How do you get in the way? How do you get in the way for access to justice in these matters of inheritance, among others? Allow me to start off by letting you know that all these distinguished speakers, you've seen their CVs, they have been projected. So they have quite a bit of knowledge. But for now, I'll allow them to briefly deal with the questions that we have for them so that we have some time for Q&A from the audience. So I hope we have microphones. I would request Honorable Lady Justice Kosibor and Christine Kungu to take the mics. And I'll start with you, Chair Lady, Federation of Women Lawyers in Kenya. Sure. What is the state of land ownership by women in Kenya?
Thank you very much, Eunice. Let me appreciate, Professor. Your assignment was well understood. You've set the platform for us. I think I want to first start by acknowledging the fact that the vulnerable and marginalized groups in Kenya, including women, bear the brunt of exclusion from ownership, from use, from transfer, and sometimes even from access and occupation of land. And indeed, because of the vulnerabilities, this is a population that we know as FIDA, we are trying to work on this. And because of the vulnerability, this has increased the issue of ownership, the issue of transfer, and the issue of use of land. Now, I've heard what Prof has said in terms of the 5% of women owning land. According to our facts as FIDA, which we projected in the FIDA Kenya National Shadow Report, only about 1% of women in Kenya own land. That is the statistics that we have as at today. And this has been contributed by a myriad of factors. For example, the inequalities that are there in Kenya, the patriarchy, the retrogressive cultural norms. In all the 47 communities, or 47 plus, maybe 3 more, probably 3/4 of those communities do not entertain a woman owning land. We also have attitudes that hinder women, and these attitudes are from educated and uneducated men who believe that a woman should not own land. And the belief is also very high in terms of perpetuating what we call the male lineage. So then you can see, as late as yesterday, I was attending for a mediation session whereby the issue was division of matrimonial property. And I remember the client told me that your client in FIDA can take away anything. She can go with the children, she can go with everything in the house, but let us not think of even thinking or dreaming about the land that we own. So you can see the patriarchy is real. And this is from educated people. We are no longer talking about uneducated, but educated men who still hold the belief that a woman should not own land in this 2025. So we can say that the issue of ownership is real. It is the elephant in the room. And we can also say that women interaction with land is limited to. But even in terms of access, it depends with the relationship that they have with the male relative. What do I mean by that? It depends with the relationship that you have with your husband.